Simplified payment verification refers to a process that was originally described in the Bitcoin whitepaper in Section 8 in 2008, almost 15 years ago now. And this simplified payment verification process is, I think, one of the least understood processes within the Bitcoin architecture, at least the intended Bitcoin architecture. Bitcoin has been architected in different ways by different people, and people are trying different things at the moment within the Bitcoin world, but simplified payment verification is an architecture that scales. It allows for the recipients of payments to verify the legitimacy of those payments without the need to rely on a Bitcoin full node or have the entire history of all of the blocks and all of the transactions on their local machine. This is achieved through a very specific process, and there is a methodology that must be followed by the recipient and by the sender of a transaction in order to properly implement and exchange the necessary information to validate a payment using SPV, Simplified Payment Verification. The SPV process starts with the sender. When a sender wishes to exchange a transaction with a recipient, which pays the recipient, the sender must gather together certain information needed by the recipient in order for the recipient to properly verify the transaction. The sender, in order to submit a transaction that complies with the simplified payment verification process and enables the recipient to properly verify it when the time comes, will need to track Merkle proofs on input transactions. What are Merkle proofs and input transactions? Merkle proofs are a method by which we can prove the existence of a Bitcoin transaction within the blockchain. And when you have a Merkle proof on a transaction, it means that when you send that Merkle proof to somebody, then with no other information than just the block headers, the small pieces of information that link blocks together, the verifier, the person who you send this Merkle proof to, will be able to know for certain, without needing the entire block, that this transaction is in that block at that location. And any blocks built on top of that block will further confirm that that proof is stable and will not change. So, those are Merkle proofs. Now we consider input transactions. Remember I said that we need Merkle proofs on the input transactions. When I, as a sender, create a transaction for you, the recipient, I must spend some Bitcoins, which are in outputs from previous transactions. These previous transactions, which gave me the Bitcoins that I am now sending to you, are my input transactions. And when I have Merkle proofs on my input transactions, it means that I know that the coins that I am sending to you are in the blockchain, and I can prove it. And so if I can prove to you that the coins that I am sending to you are in the blockchain, then when you receive this incoming transaction, you are able to also know that these coins, well, they were in my possession, and that's because I'm signing them over to you, and also that they were in the blockchain, meaning they weren't just I didn't make them up, right? So I gathered together Merkle proofs on all of the input transactions that I am using. And then when I create the transaction for you, the recipient, I send it along with the input transactions and the Merkle proofs. Now, let's flip over to the recipient side of the equation. When I receive a transaction from somebody, I want to make sure that the coins that I have received are legitimate and that I will be able to use them when I need to. So, the value for me as the recipient in the Simplified Payment Verification Architecture, and when I say sending, by the way, I should clarify. The sender directly exchanges the information with the recipient. Directly. So, not sending like just putting a transaction on the blockchain, not here is an address and I will send money to this address, but rather, how did I, as the sender, come to know the recipient's address? I had to have some direct communication channel with that recipient. I had to have some way of learning that address. How do I know where to send the coins to? I got that address from somewhere. That somewhere is very important because that somewhere is the communications channel between this sender and this recipient. There is some communications channel by which these parties are exchanging information, such as, how many coins would you like me to send? That is the question maybe the sender will ask. What is your address? And then the recipient responds over this communications channel, yes, here is my address. Now you may send me some coins. So the point is, no matter how abstractly defined, there always exists a communications channel between the sender and the recipient. And that communications channel, not sending a transaction, putting it up on the blockchain, and expecting the recipient to sort through all of the transactions on the entire blockchain to look for the one that is in that address that they were looking for. How about just send it over the communications channel, that same way that you exchanged the address and the amount of coins to begin with? Because when you send a transaction, when a sender sends a transaction to a recipient over a communications channel directly, there is no need for that recipient to go trawling through every transaction ever created in order to find the one they're looking for. That is an architecture that will not scale. The architecture that will scale, using that communications channel to exchange payment information, transactions. A sender can use a communications channel to communicate directly with the recipient of the payment about the transaction that is being exchanged, and can send that transaction itself along with proofs on all of the coins being used, that they are in the blockchain, that they are valid, and that is how the recipient will get access to this information. That is very important. Now we can talk about the recipient. So the recipient receives over a communications channel directly in a peer-to-peer manner from the sender, not from the miners, not from looking at all of the transactions ever in the entire blockchain, but from the sender over the communications channel, receives a transaction. And proof that all of the coins that are being used as inputs to that transaction are what is known as well anchored. What does that mean? Well anchored? It means that these coins are in the blockchain. It means that the transactions that are being used as input are solidified in the blockchain, and as a recipient, I have block headers. I don't have the entire blockchain. I just have the little bits of information that link the blocks in the blockchain together and prove the proof of work that the miners have done. So the block headers can be used to ensure that transactions in the blockchain are valid and have been accepted by the largest pool of CPU power. So we can use these block headers. It's very useful for a recipient to have them. Recipients should look for as many block headers from as many miners as they can find, and download all of them and check them and make sure the proof of work is legitimate, and you can see which one's the longest. You can see this should be the correct blockchain because it's got the most proof of work. It's been accepted by the most miners. Miners are actively mining on top of this block, right? So we know that these headers are correct because everybody on the blockchain knows the rules of the blockchain are public. The miners are mining on top of it. So I have these headers as the recipient, and the sender is going to send me proof that their input transactions are included in one of the blocks associated with one of those headers that I have accepted, because I see that it's part of the chain with the most proof of work. I don't need to know about everything in those blocks. I only need to see proof that this particular transaction, the one the sender is giving me, is in that block, is anchored in that block. So the input transaction is anchored. And if I know that every input transaction and every parent transaction of the transaction that is now being submitted is anchored, then we use the term well anchored to define that the transaction I am now receiving, the subject transaction, the one that actually pays me, is well anchored. All of its inputs have been proven to be in the blockchain. Now, there are a couple of other things that I can do as the recipient of this transaction. Of course, I don't know that it's not double spent yet. That's a problem, isn't it? So, firstly, I should verify the chain of custody. The Bitcoin white paper says we define a coin as a chain of digital signatures that transfer ownership, paraphrasing a little bit, from one person to the next. So if the Bitcoins in the input transaction that I know are valid because it's been proven to me that those coins are valid, are spent to me or are sent into a transaction which I now have, I should verify the scripts, the Bitcoin script code that transfers the ownership of these coins from one party to the next. And by verifying these coins, and by checking the signatures, and by validating the chain of custody, I know that there exists somebody who has signed or has authorized these coins be sent to me. When I know this information, I know that one of two things is true. Either the party who has, in fact, I already know, authorized these coins be transferred to me is honest, and they are honestly sending me these coins, or they have signed multiple transactions to different parties and attempted to double spend and defraud me, because I know that they have signed them to me, my scripts execute and are valid. If there are others, and if they represent to me that these coins are valid, then they've just committed fraud. Consider that. And you have proof. If someone tries to defraud you as a recipient in the SPV system, you have proof. because you have a signed transaction. That signed transaction is evidence. And if another transaction gets accepted into a block, you have a transaction that was given to you. And then you have the one that was in the block, which is public. And when you have one that was signed to you with certain inputs, and one that was signed in a block with certain inputs, and those inputs are the same inputs, somebody double spent. Somebody committed fraud. And if you implement KYC procedures, if you know your customer or the person you are dealing with, your counterparty, you know who committed fraud. And you can stop it. That's how SPV works. That's how you can verify transactions at scale without needing to run a full network node and have all the blocks. And if you do this process properly, and if you yourself are honest, and if your counterparties are honest, your transactions will work. And if your counterparties defraud you by double spending, you have a couple ways of combating this actually. I just talked about one. Number one, know your customer, right? That way, you know who committed fraud. Number two, check with the miners. Bitcoin SV miners are very open about what transactions they intend to include in a block and what transactions they consider a double spend attempt before the block is even mined. So within a few seconds of receiving a transaction, you can send it to a few miners. There's Tal, Gorilla Pool, among others. And you can check with them using their APIs what they intend to do. And miners build reputation. They do proof of work. Will the miners consider your transaction to be valid? You can get a pretty strong indication immediately after you receive it. And if you end up being wrong, or if you end up running into problems as time goes on with this process, there are a number of things you can do. You can increase your controls to prevent fraud. You can reduce the amounts that you receive so that there's less incentive for fraud, if that's possible. Or you can require more verification and more thorough vetting, for example, waiting for a block confirmation, waiting for a Merkle proof on the received transaction that you have before accepting it. But either way, whether the transaction gets into a block and then gets reorganized or not, if there is a double spend that conflicts with it, and if you know the party you're dealing with, you have the ability to combat fraud. And you have the ability to verify legitimate transactions with a reasonable degree of confidence. That's how the SPV architecture works in Bitcoin. You receive proofs on all input transactions. You ensure that your transaction that you're receiving is well anchored. And you validate the chain of custody, signing and transferring ownership of coins, transferring custody of coins, from one party to the other, until you have a fully linked and anchored transfer of custody to you, the recipient. That's all I have to say in this one. SPV is a useful architecture. People should use it if they want to scale. Thank you for taking the time.